We had that major oral argument in Michael Cargill versus the ATF and Merrick Garland over whether or not putting a bump stock on your semi-automatic rifle converts it into a machine gun as defined by federal law. There was a lot of questions about what kinds of arguments were made by the lawyer in support of Michael Cargill against the ATF, and I thought overall he made all the points that needed to be made in terms of why simply adding a bump stock does not convert a rifle into a machine gun. But let's break down some of the questions by the Supreme Court justices. I'm going to play them for you directly so you can hear the perspectives of both the conservative and the liberal justices on some of these points and the responses there too. I think you're not going to want to miss this. I think you're going to find this quite interesting because, again, if we don't get the Supreme Court on our team, that's a big blow to the Second Amendment movement all across this country. Stay tuned. Let's talk about it when we get back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and author of many books, including Disarmed: What the Ukraine War Teaches Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. All right, folks, so here's the story. Major oral argument in Cargill versus ATF and Merrick Garland involving whether or not bump stocks, when you add them to a semi-automatic rifle, somehow convert that rifle into a machine gun, and thus according to the ATF, bump stocks can be banned. Just as a reminder, under the 1934 National Firearms Act, the definition of machine gun is essentially that a weapon that shoots or is designed to shoot automatically with a single function of the trigger, multiple rounds without manual reloading. The critical terms for the fight here is the word, what does automatically mean, as opposed to manually, I would say. And then likewise, what is the phrase, a single function of the trigger? A single function of the trigger. What does that mean? We will break that down more grammatically in future videos, but for now, I just want you to understand that there was a lot of arguments made in this case in questions about whether or not automatically is satisfied and or whether or not this, the bump stock functions off a single function of the trigger as opposed to multiple functions of the trigger, let's say, and what this all means. And I want you to hear the back and forth between the lawyer for Michael Cargill and the justices. So let's start right off the top with a question by Chief Justice John Roberts. Very important to understand what he was curious about because he is arguably a swing vote in this case. Specifically, he is asking about what's the story with maintaining pressure on the foregrip when you're using a bump stock, and what does that mean here? This is the response by the attorney for Michael Cargill, Mr. Mitchell. Let's play it for you now and see if you agree with what the answer was and if you would have given the same answer if asked by Chief Justice John Roberts. Roll the tape.
Energy. But, Mr. Chief Justice, I don't think the answer to this question matters in the end, because even if we accept Mr. Fletcher's characterization, where it's just constant pressure with the same amount of force continuously over a sustained period of time, it's still a manual action. There's nothing automatic about that. The shooter is the one who is pushing. It's human effort, human exertion, nothing automatic at all about this process. And Mr. Fletcher said during his remarks that the bump stock harnesses the recoil energy of the weapon. That is false. With the Kagan's accelerator, there is harnessing, because the Kagan's accelerator has a spring. So there will be certain types of bump firing devices like the Kagan's accelerator where you can accurately say that the bump stock harnesses the recoil energy of the weapon. Not so with respect to a non-mechanical bump stock. The weapon recoils, nothing is harnessed with respect to the recoil energy, and it is the shooter who must, with that non-shooting hand, continue to thrust the weapon forward in response.
I thought that was overall a pretty good answer, but then let's turn to Justice Amy Coney Barrett, where she actually talked about a hypothetical in something that she conceptually invented called a band bump or a bump band firing device. And she was trying to understand how this might work and trying to get answers from Mr. Cargill's lawyer about what the word automatically means. Because again, the government, in order to show that a bump stock is a machine gun or converts a semi-automatic rifle into a machine gun, has to win two things. That doing so makes the gun fire automatically, and it does so because of a single function of the trigger. So Justice Barrett asked the following question, and then we'll see what the answer is all at the same time. Let's go to the tape right now.
Within the question.
Well, speaking of automatically, can you address the question I asked Mr. Fletcher about a band bump firing? And, he said it was different on the ground of automatically, but how do you see them functioning differently?
They're indistinguishable when it comes to automatically. Everything involved with the band that Your Honor suggested, and also everything involved with Mr. Cargill's non-mechanical bump stock, is a manual action undertaken entirely by the shooter. There is no automating device. Mr. Fletcher has yet to identify any device in the non-mechanical bump stock that automates any task that is necessary for successful bump firing. It is all being done by the shooter. There's the recoil after the shot gets fired, and then it is the shooter who must, with his own hand and with his own force, exert pressure forward consistently to make sure that the trigger bumps into his finger. This is all manual. Nothing automatic about it. Nothing at all.
I think that was a good answer. And keep in mind, the thing to understand here is that the Obama administration, the George W. Bush administration, the first part of the Trump administration, the ATF every step of the way concluded that bump stocks, when you add them to a semi-automatic rifle, are simply not machine guns. So the Trump administration midway with the ATF flipped 180 degrees, but it's very important to understand that that was not the case for many years and people relied upon it. But again, keep in mind that the phrase under what is a machine gun includes the single function of a trigger. So the question is, does a bump stock change the nature or the inherent component or characteristic of a trigger? The answer is undeniably no. Let's see what Michael Cargill's lawyer says on the question of whether or not the trigger is altered by virtue of adding a bump stock. Let's go to the tape.
It down.
What makes it hard is whether it's changed the nature of the trigger in some way. Clearly that happened in camp. This situation with Mr. Cargill, there's not even an argument that the trigger has been changed. Neither DOJ at no point in this litigation has argued that bump stocks change the nature of the trigger or change the trigger at all.
So again, you can see that the trigger is not being changed. I think we understand this, but I should note that Justice Clarence Thomas, who's usually pretty good on gun-related and Second Amendment-related issues, obviously, he really wanted to push Michael Cargill's lawyer on the question about rate of fire. Now, we've talked about how the phrase rate of fire or rapidity of shots is not actually in the definition of a machine gun. So the reason why that's important is I could fire a semi-automatic pistol or rifle super fast with my fingers, or even a revolver super fast with my fingers, and I can actually fire that faster, let's say, than a fully automatic machine gun in concept, and it would still not change the nature of the guns. Meaning, for example, if I had a fully automatic machine gun where I pulled the trigger and held it down and it automatically fired one round a minute, that would be a very slow rate of fire. But legally speaking, if it's a single function of the trigger, and, of course, it's automatically firing one round a minute, guess what? That's a machine gun, even though the rate of fire is super slow versus like even a revolver. So again, rate of fire is not part of what makes a machine gun under federal law. Nevertheless, Clarence Thomas asked a lot of questions about this rate of fire concept in conjunction with the trigger. Let's go to this back and forth between Justice Thomas on the one hand and the lawyer for Michael Cargill right now.
Mr. Mitchell, I think you would agree that the bump stock accelerates the rate of fire.
Absolutely.
Why wouldn't you then take the further step of saying it changes the nature of the trigger in doing that?
Because the trigger still has to reset after every single shot. It's not accelerating the rate of fire by changing the trigger. It's accelerating the rate of fire.
That's not really what
I'm sorry.
So why wouldn't you say that you have enhanced the triggering mechanism by using the bump stock?
Because it's not changing the triggering mechanism at all. It's simply making it easier for the shooter to bump that trigger repeatedly. The nature of the triggering mechanism remains exactly the same. What's going on inside the gun after the trigger gets bumped is no different than what it would be if it were a semi-automatic rifle without the bump stock. And that's why the government can't win on this single function of the trigger point.
So there you have it. Good discussion here, but I should note that Justice Thomas persisted. He asked yet another question about the rate of fire. But the reality is, I think this is the same sort of mistake that Clarence Thomas seems to be making. Now, whether or not he's asking these questions because he's trying to play devil's advocate to get the best answers from the lawyer for Michael Cargill or not, we don't know. But I will tell you, it is not unusual 4 Supreme Court justices to ask questions they know the answer to, and they're not doing it for their personal benefit. They're doing it to educate other people on the bench. I believe there's a very famous story where maybe I'll find this and play it for you. Justice Anthony Scalia, who was an avid hunter and knew all about guns. He was actually on the high school rifle team, so he knew everything there was to know about firearms. Justice Scalia, of course, and he was the author of the Heller decision. I bring this up because there was one time where Justice Scalia asked an attorney, what is a .22 rimfire long rifle round? And again, everyone knew that Justice Scalia knew exactly what that was, but he was asking about a .22 rimfire round for handguns because he was trying to have the lawyer educate his colleagues who obviously did not know what a .22 rimfire bullet was or round was. So an example, just because Clarence Thomas is asking these questions does not mean he doesn't know the answer. He may be doing these for a different purpose, such as persuading one of his other colleagues. So just keep that in mind as you listen to that back and forth between Justice Thomas on the one hand and the lawyer for Michael Cargill on the other.
I think the difference is that there may be some who believe, when you look at it, the nature of the firing has changed as a result of the bump stock. So if that's changed, why don't you simply then look backwards and say that the nature of the firing mechanism has changed? Thus, the nature of the trigger has changed.
I thought one of the more powerful arguments that the lawyer for Michael Cargill made was what I call the 1-to-1 ratio, where he basically explains to the court that for every pull of the trigger, or for every round, if you will, or every turn of the trigger, whatever you want to say it, function of the trigger, 1 round is released, and it's a 1-to-1 ratio. I thought this was a clever argument and pretty good. Let's roll the tape and see what he says, and see if you agree with what Mr. Mitchell said when it comes to defending Michael Cargill on the bump stocks. Right here, right now.
What's changed, though, is the rate of fire, and it's still 1 shot per function of the trigger. Even though those shots are coming out of the barrel a lot faster than they were before. The question is, how many functions of the trigger do we have for each of the shots? And the answer is 1. If you divide the number of shots that are fired from a bump stock equipped rifle by the number of times the trigger has to function to produce that shot, the answer will always be 1. And it will remain that way because nothing in the triggering mechanism has changed.
Now, I just want to wrap up with a question from anti-gun Justice Elena Kagan, where she, of course, starts off with saying, I, Justice Kagan, am a very serious textualist. I really care about the text of the statute here. Well, of course, that's fine, and then listen carefully, because she talks about being a great textualist, but then she goes on to use a critical weasel word, really a weasel word phrase, common sense. Because listen to what she asked. She says, yes, I'm a textualist, but we need to use a little bit of common sense, which is bing, 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 bing. You know what that means? Weasel word for leftist judges to try to get around the meaning of the statute because they don't like the outcome that the text gives them. So let's look at this back and forth between liberal Justice Elena Kagan on the one hand and Michael Cargill's lawyer on the other hand. And you tell me whether or not you think he did a good job responding to this question and these questions with Justice Elena Kagan right here, right now.
Mr. Mitchell, I'll tell you, I view myself as a good textualist. I think that that's the way we should think about statutes. It's by reading them. But, textualism is not inconsistent with common sense. Like at some point, you have to apply a little bit of common sense to the way you read a statute and understand that what this statute comprehends is a weapon that fires a multitude of shots with a single human action, whether it's a continuous pressure on a conventional machine gun holding the trigger or a continuous pressure on one of these devices on the barrel. I can't understand how anybody could think that those two things should be treated differently.
Well, they're treated differently because the statute turns on a single function of the trigger. And the problem for the government is they're not able to change the nature of the trigger that currently exists on a semi-automatic rifle simply by adding a bump stock, which is nothing more than a casing that allows the rifle to slide back and forth. The trigger is exactly the same as what it was before, and the function of the trigger is exactly the same as what it was before.
So I thought overall that was a pretty good answer, but he really kind of called her out politely and professionally that Justice Kagan was trying to rewrite the statute, because that's exactly what's going on here. Because again, the government, to win this case, if you were being honest here and we're serious and we're not trying to be outcome determinant politicians in black robes, which is always a danger, especially in gun related cases, the reality is the only way the ATF can win this case and show that a bump stock attached to a semi-automatic rifle is a machine gun is they have to show that by doing so it causes the gun to fire automatically. That's one element. And then they also have to show that it fires automatically because of a single function of the trigger, which we're going to talk about a lot more about the single function of the trigger and the very strong argument grammatically in a video coming up very soon. But for now, let me know what you thought about the performance of the lawyer on behalf of Michael Cargill and what you thought about the questions from the justices on these points. And I hope you learned something here today at the Four Boxes Diner. Make sure you follow me on X at Four Boxes Diner. And please subscribe and resubscribe to this channel. We're having problems to get our numbers up. We're way behind everyone else. We're trying to at least get to 150,000 subscribers. We're working hard to get there. So hopefully you'll help us out on that. And again, we appreciate your time here. Hope you learned something. And we will see you again soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.